Hello, this week I want to talk about the C's. C is for circular conversations, closure, cluster B personality disorder. If I've got enough time, codependency, I might have to knock that on to another podcast. And while I'm going through them, I'm going to try and find examples to show you of a wound in action and how it would play out. Welcome to the Mindfuckery podcast, which is FeedSpot's fifth must-listen to podcast on emotional abuse. I'm your host Elizabeth, and in here we explore areas others are feared to tread. Through my own personal journey, I know how much this hurts and how confusing life becomes. So many questions, no closure and no real answers. I've been a woundologist for over 20 years. I'm the unintentional author of Finding Lily, the A to Z of emotional abuse and divorce matters. I help you clear past life wounds, ancestral trauma and this life wounding. And as the founder of the Inner Healing Sanctuary, I've created Wound Talking, the original Wound and Quantum Glow. I'm on a mission to help educate as many people as I can on the effects of trauma on our lives and our children's lives, and healing the wounds of our mothers and our fathers. It stops here, it stops now, it stops with us. So welcome along for the journey of a lifetime. And you are very, very welcome, as always. Over the last few podcasts, I've been reading from my book, and I've got to C. So C is for, I listed them all. I think I'm going to have to split this over two. C is for circular conversations, closure, cluster B personality disorder, codependency, coercive control, cognitive dissonance, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, crazy X. It actually says CX for crazy X. I think I was running out of words at that point. And C is for crazy making, CZ. I will touch on them anyway. We'll see how we get on. I'm hoping to do at least 3, maybe 4, but I also want to give you some wounds as well. So I came about writing the book back in 2017. I was actually writing another book called That Effing Pink Umbrella, and I think I'd actually written it, most of it anyway, but it just didn't sit right. It was more of a dump for me to get all that emotional baggage out, the anger, the hurt, everything. But what I had been doing was I'd stumbled across in 2016 and 2015 the term narcissist, and so I started to look and wonder whether this is what I'd experienced. And I found listened to one video, and the lady on there was talking about mindfuckery, hence the title of this, because it stuck, because it just felt right within my body. It vibrated and it just said, yeah, this is mindfuckery. Whether you've been subject to narcissistic abuse, would you be able to prove it? No, because at the time I was being portrayed as the person that was crazy. I was the one that he couldn't live with. I really struggle sharing some of my story, and not because I'm not over it or it's still painful or hurts, because I'm so far away from that. There's no pain, absolutely nothing. Is it appropriate? And am I, or will I be seen as like bashing or attacking or saying what happened to get back at him? And again, I'm so far away from that. And that's what divorcing emotionally for me is. It's being right the way through the other side that you feel nothing. But I am aware that he has families, children, so it's really difficult. I'd actually found him on a dating website talking to people, actively talking to people, and I'm fairly sure that he was meeting up with them, but I don't have the proof. And there was something inside me one day, and we'd been away on a work weekend, and something said, this doesn't feel right. It was the language and the behaviour and a telephone conversation that was off. So I drove to where he was allegedly, on the area that he was, and he then told other people that I was stalking him. And I said to him, did you actually tell them that I found you on a dating website? Did you tell them? No, you didn't tell them any of this. So there's all this stuff. I've got no proof. I was the crazy one. I was the one that was irrational. I had trust issues. I'm sure on some level you will have experienced something very similar. And it's confusing, and you think this is all your fault. And I took responsibility, and I still take responsibility for the role that I played, because I saw red flags, and I know of the wounds that I saw and I was picking up on. And I don't know, whatever it was, the healer in me became codependent. I took on that role of trying to save, I suppose, perhaps the parent I wasn't able to save as a child. And I discovered lots of different terms, and I was then having to go and look them up and find out what circular conversation really was. What does that mean? So I might hear it or I might read about it. And there I go. And I thought, well, if I'm having to look this up, other people must do. So I got the definition of whatever it was, and I then wrote about it, what it feels like in the body, what it feels like, the confusion, etc., etc. And that is really how the A to Z came about. So the first C is circular conversations, and these are arguments that go on endlessly. You believe you've got a resolution, but they're resurrected again, repeating the same pattern, leaving you confused and exhausted. And if you experience this, it wasn't about understanding, and it certainly wasn't about compromise. It was all about power and control. I remember feeling drained and confused each time this happened. There was an initial feeling of relief that we'd reached a conclusion, and then the conversation would start again, and mentally I'd be asking myself why. I would agree again to the same terms, the feeling of relief again, believing it was over, only to find out within hours or the next day it had started again. But I thought we'd agreed. Yes, but, and off it would go again, and the same statements, the same conclusions. And it wasn't until I was out of the relationship I realised this was part of the game. And one of the biggest things I realised when the relationship was over was the power and control that I handed over. And I'm sure that's exactly what you have done. It wasn't until afterwards that I was able to see that these relationships are confusing. It is all about power. It is all about control, but it's done from a vulnerable place because they don't want to lose you. They don't know who they are until they're ready, until you have nothing else to give them. And then on their terms, they move on, they walk away. So the next C is for closure. Relationship closure involves honest, healthy, non-judgmental communication that helps with letting go. Being denied closure when you're breaking up is unhealthy. It's damaging, destructive, and controlling. Relationships break down for different reasons. Healthy people are able to acknowledge what isn't working. It can be painful, but closure is helpful in moving on for both parties. But this wasn't a healthy relationship. The ending of this relationship was painful. The abuser created a strong bond with you, and during the repeated love bombing stage, trauma bonding you. And when they have drained everything from you, you were no longer of use to them, they just walked away. During the discard stage, they told you what you did wrong, and their explanation, if you got one, was blame shifting, and you were left believing this was all your fault. The bond was so strong and the withdrawal so painful that you looked for ways of getting the relationship back to where you were in the beginning during that idealization stage. It might be that you've gone into a spiral of questioning what if and if only, trying to understand where you went wrong, replaying situations and conversations. If only you had done something differently or said something else, would it have ended? Why didn't you get the closure? There are a few reasons for this. Firstly, they are the victim. It was your behaviour that caused the breakup in the relationship. The attention they received from their friends and family and work colleagues, the person next to them on the train, supplies them. Why would they give that up? Secondly, seeing you in pain is supply. They don't care if it's negative or positive, it's supply. All the time you're in pain, confused, asking questions, the focus is still on them. They have no empathy. They can't put themselves in your shoes, and they don't want to understand the pain that you're in. Knowing that they have caused this pain is the proof they need to show you how powerful they are, and reinforces the amount of control they still have over you. So to summarise, giving you closure will not serve them in any way. They would be giving up that attention that they claim they don't want from you. They would be handing you back the power and control of your life. Another reason would be having to acknowledge that they were somehow to blame, and they can't do that. Their damaged inner child can't handle it. One of the reasons that a lot of people will say go no contact, and I know you do have to with children go down the Great Rock route, but going no contact gives you space. It creates space. There's a pain that comes with these relationships, and you don't know what to do with yourself. There's a pain of loneliness that you might experience. These are wounds. And it might be that you were treated like this. And always go back to the first 7 to 8 years of your childhood where you learnt the rules for your life. You learnt how important you were or how unimportant you were. You learnt that your needs were paramount. You learned that your needs were overridden by everyone. You learned so many different things. It might be that you had to give in to other siblings and you took a lower role. You might have been the scapegoat, taking the blame for everything. You were given love, attention, you were seen and heard, but there was a condition. You might not have been seen and heard. And these all create wounds. These wounds sit in your body and they attract other people. And it might be that you had a parent who was always playing the victim. Everything went wrong for them. It wasn't fair. Nothing was fair. Life wasn't fair to them. And as a child, you don't have the mechanisms in place to save that. And there's something on the subconscious level that has registered. You're a child. You can't save an adult. You see someone and you recognize a wound that they might have. It speaks to you. And so when this abuser turns up in your life and they play the victim, you recognize it. And something inside you on a subconscious level is thinking, I can help this person and finally get to save them. I see this wound, I recognize it. Of course, it's not talking to you in that way, but energetically, you recognize the wound and something inside you wants to protect that person, wants to save them because you weren't able to do that to the adult in your life growing up. These wounds are painful. And then because the abuser doesn't want saving, because it served them in no way, that wounding or playing victim is where they get their attention. They don't want to be healed because it serves them in no way. If they throw that crutch away, where does their attention come from? To them, they don't know how to love themselves. They don't see themselves as lovable. They very possibly didn't disconnect from their mother and they have no identity. Therefore, they don't like themselves. And you might think, well, I actually don't like myself. And you might feel shame and you might feel guilt for things that you've done and said in the way that you've behaved. But you can heal. And that is something that they will never be able to do. And the next C is for Cluster B personality disorder. Cluster B is a group of characteristics of egocentric people who have difficulty seeing any reason or need to regulate impulses. Personality disorders are diagnosed by professionals, but because the toxic person or the emotionally abusive person can't take responsibility, they will never willingly get a diagnosis. The Cluster B personality disorder is the dramatic, emotional or erratic personality disorders, which consist of antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, borderline personality disorder, BPD, histrionic personality disorder, HPD, narcissistic personality disorder, NPD. Please remember that we're all on the scale as we are on all scales. So you might score a 3 or a 30, whereas the emotional abuser or the toxic person might score a 75 or a 90. You may recognize something of yourself. If you feel that you have one of these disorders, please go and speak to someone. And the other important thing to point out, coming out of these relationships, you've been told this is all your fault. You might have even been called a narcissist, and this is somebody projecting onto you and said, we're all on the spectrum, we're all on that scale. As a baby, you needed some of these attention-seeking responses to survive. As we get older, we learn to break away from our caregivers. We learn to become more independent. We learn who we are, or we get an understanding of who we are. Whether we're able to step into the person that we really are, again, comes down to the dynamics. There are other things to consider with this. Have you picked up narcissistic fleas? If you grew up in an environment with one or both parents being higher up on the spectrum, you might have picked up some of their ways. You might have learned some manipulative techniques. You might have learned triangulation because that was mirrored to you. That was what happened in your dynamics. And later as you grew up, you realize, oh, this isn't actually how other people behave in their family unit. There are so many different elements to this. If you've been living in an environment with someone, or it is very possible that you've taken on some of their behaviours. The other thing that I discovered whilst I was healing was some of the wounds that I had or thought I had weren't actually mine. I did some work. I know they weren't mine, but I'd been convinced that this was an issue that I had. You can believe that you have got narcissistic tendencies and perhaps you've got wounds that need healing. The next is for codependency, which is a relationship which is controlled or manipulated by another. There's an excessive reliance on other people for approval and a sense of identity. Definitions of codependency vary. An emotionally abusive or toxic person manufactures actions. The intention was to create desire, jealousy, dependence, addiction and anxiety. You made sacrifices for your partner's happiness. Perhaps you are only just realizing this now. They did this very slowly, gaining your trust, breaking down your boundaries. Slowly they created the person they believed you were looking for, putting on a mask, playing a character. They created a fake future with you. They used tactics like triangulation to create jealousy, making them look popular and wanted. And their favourite tool, cognitive dissonance, which allowed them to maneuver themselves into a place of power, and they started to control your life. And their favourite tool, gaslighting, which allowed them to maneuver themselves into a place of power, and they started to control your life. As children, we're codependent. We need our parents to provide for our needs. You may have experienced this if a parent was overprotective, not allowing you healthy boundaries or the room to grow and mature. When I first started hearing about codependency, I refused to accept that label. No way was I codependent. And then over a period of time, I realised, oh, wow, actually, I did become codependent. And I think some of these emotions like loneliness stems from these relationships, because you turn around and everybody's gone. But there's also a deep loneliness. I described it like being unplugged, and I used an electric vehicle as an example. I felt like I had been like a charging point. If you look at the abuser or the toxic person as the electric car, they can only drive for a certain distance without needing to be topped up with charge. And this is what I felt. I remember one day really clearly. It was something like the 7th of June, and that's how clearly I remember it. And I felt like I'd been completely disconnected, and that was it. It was done. It was over. Although it played out for a few more months, I felt that complete disconnect in that moment. The next C is for coercive control. Talk a lot about coercive control. One of my favourite subjects. It's because a lot of people are talking about it. It's easy when it's broken down to realise that abuse did take place. Coercive control is described as an act or a pattern of assault carried out through forms of threats, humiliation and intimidation. Coercive control is emotional abuse, and it is used to punish, harm and frighten the victim. This form of behaviour is used to make the victim dependent on the abuser, isolating them from friends and family. They exploit them and deprive them of their independence, regulate their everyday behaviour. Coercive control, it's a pattern that occurs over time, used for one individual to exert power and control over another. Coercive or controlling behaviour is now a crime in the UK. The law came into force on the 29th of December 2015. In July 2019, Sally Challen walked free from court, which is now being used as a landmark case that I hope will change the court's process when dealing with the real victim. Sally murdered her husband in 2010, and at the time of her conviction, coercive control was not a crime in England and Wales, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment. Following the change in the law, Justice for Women submitted new grounds of appeal in 2017. These were refused by the judge. In February 2019, Harriet Wisrich asked for Sally's conviction to be overturned, and following the hearing, she was released in April on conditional bail. In June 2019, prosecutors accepted Sally's plea of manslaughter, and at this stage, Sally had served 8 years and 10 months, and her retrial was later dropped. Coercive control creates invisible chains. People might ask why you didn't leave earlier, or why you didn't see what was going on. On some level, you did know there was something wrong with the relationship. However, during the cycle of abuse, there was a point where you lost who you were, and your focus was more on protecting the relationship than protecting yourself. It was these invisible chains that stopped you from walking away. The fake future stopped you from moving on. You were waiting for the next hit of oxytocin you received during the love bombing. You found yourself in a world manufactured by the abuser, and you found yourself living in confusion and fear. Some common examples Examples of coercive behaviour are isolating you from friends and family, monitoring your time, monitoring you by online communication tools or spyware, taking control over aspects of your everyday life, such as where you can go, who you can see, what you can wear, when you can sleep, depriving you of access to support services such as medical services, repeatedly putting you down, so saying you're worthless, humiliating, degrading or dehumanizing you, controlling your finances, making threats or intimidating you. And I've read articles and I've seen videos saying if you're in an abusive relationship, get out. If you're in an abusive relationship, it's very likely that you do not realise you are, or the invisible chains are holding you there. It would be amazing if it were that simple, just to walk away, but it isn't. It takes time to untangle from the invisible chains that held you there. And going back to Sally Challen, I remember reading about this story while they were sorting out the trial, and her story came up and it's been in a few newspapers. And the patterns that I could see was she was very young, he was a bit older, he was very manipulative, he was very controlling. He had his own business. He made her go out to work once she was able to. The children were a little bit older. And then he withheld finances. So all of the money that she earned, she had to use to pay the bills and food, etc., etc. He was, if I've got it right, I think he was using prostitutes. She discovered that. And there were so many different elements. They separated and he was saying to her that they could get back together. Now, she'd been with him since she was 15 years old, and she was being led to believe that, and this is, I've picked up from newspapers and articles. I've never spoken to her. It's what I picked up. I was also following on Twitter some of the story. And he was saying to her, if you sign the house over to me so I get everything, we'll get back together again. And she then discovered, as they weren't living together at the time, had moved out. She then discovered that he was actually seeing 2 or 3 people. I'm not actually sure, maybe it was only one, but he was definitely seeing someone, and he had been dating other people before this woman. I had this feeling that wasn't just one. These relationships are dangerous. You don't know who you are. They change the chemistry within your brain. You become so dependent on someone, you don't know how to live without them. And then when you're not getting the intermittent reinforcement that you were getting, that smoothed it over and it made everything okay for a short period of time, really can turn you crazy. And it's a pain that is deep within your soul that you might not know where it comes from. And that would definitely be a wound of abandonment, betrayal, or shame that you're experiencing. I actually did more than I thought I was going to do. So I'm going to pick up cognitive dissonance and complex post-traumatic stress disorder on another podcast. If you're really interested in healing on a deep level, I'm running a workshop in September. I'll put a link in the description box below to register your interest. If you fill it in, once I've got the date confirmed, it'll be online. Once I've got that confirmed, I will send you all the details through. And what I'll be teaching you is how to identify and understand your emotional wounds. I'll teach you techniques to communicate with them and help you heal them. And I teach you different ways of raising your vibration. And we look at personalizing your healing journey. You'll also have access to the workshop after the event. There'll be guided meditations and exercises to support your healing journey going forward, and there'll be a live Q&A, and I'll put together a community that you can go in and support each other while you're doing this. I hope this week's been helpful. So C is for circular conversations, closure, cluster B personality, codependency, and coercive control. If you know anyone who would benefit from listening to this, please share this with them. And as always, I'm sending you loads and loads of love. Until next time.